Welcome to Open Mind Galaxy. Today we're talking about France.
France is a bit like that dramatic movie that never ends. Ready for a rundown?
More than ready, let's go. So, what's happened in domestic politics under Macron?
Macron, the king of political upheaval. In 2017, he dethroned traditional parties with La République En Marche. It was a political revolution, but it didn't last. The Yellow Vests in 2018 were a revolt against fuel taxes, and they exposed a deep social divide. This spontaneous, leaderless movement shook the country for months.
And did he manage to calm things down?
He tried with a national grand debate, a series of local discussions across the country, over 10,000 public meetings. While the French appreciated being heard, the tangible results were limited. Many saw it as a PR exercise rather than a real solution.
And then came the COVID crisis, right?
Exactly. COVID-19 changed everything. Lockdowns, curfews, and an at-all-costs economic policy to avoid collapse. But this management left a bitter taste. The French criticized the government for its lack of clarity, especially regarding masks and vaccines.
And he still got reelected?
Yes, in 2022, but it wasn't a walk in the park. His opposition was divided, which worked in his favor. However, his party lost its majority in the National Assembly. He went from being an uncontested leader to a president who must constantly negotiate to govern.
And that's where Article 49.3 comes in?
Exactly. It's a constitutional tool that allows the government to pass a law without a vote unless a motion of no confidence is adopted. Macron used it several times, notably for controversial reforms like pensions. This added fuel to the protest fire.
Pensions? Why is that so sensitive in France?
Because it's a symbol. Changing the retirement age directly impacts people's quality of life. Macron wanted to raise it from 62 to 64. For many, it was the last straw, especially after years of social tension.
And today, what's the situation?
France remains divided. Strikes regularly paralyze key sectors like transport and education. Polls show low confidence in the government. With rising tensions, some wonder if French institutions can continue to absorb these shocks.
So, if I understand correctly, the question is, what can Macron do to rebuild trust?
Exactly. The next step will be crucial. Either he manages to unite the country or the divisions risk deepening further. And honestly, it's a very complex equation.
Let's move to the economy. With everything you've described, it sounds like the situation is just as tense in this area.
That's an understatement. In 2017, Macron wanted to shake things up by reforming labor laws to make them more flexible. Employers liked it, but for many workers, it felt like increased job insecurity. That was just the beginning.
And the Yellow Vests played a role here too, didn't they?
Absolutely. Their movement was a direct response to the economic injustice felt by many. Between fuel taxes and rising living costs, Macron had to act fast, canceling some taxes and increasing the minimum wage. But the damage was done. The gap between the elites and the people had widened further.
Then came the pandemic. How did it impact the French economy?
France plunged into a historic recession. GDP contracted by 8% in 2020, which is huge. Macron launched emergency measures, spending up to 200 billion euros. This mitigated the damage, but also pushed public debt to record levels.
And after the pandemic, were they able to bounce back?
Not really. The 2024 Olympics gave a temporary 0.4% growth boost. But structural problems remained: weak household consumption, timid private investment, and public debt exceeding 110% of GDP.
And reforms like the pension one, were they also meant to reduce this debt?
Exactly. But trying to raise the retirement age triggered another wave of massive strikes and protests. These reforms were essential on paper, but politically, it was a minefield.
And the current budget situation?
Challenging. In 2023, the public deficit exceeded expectations at 5.5% of GDP, well above the 4.4% target. Total debt surpasses 3.2 trillion euros, and for 2025, the government is planning drastic austerity measures. But with political instability, it's uncertain if these measures will pass.
So everything hinges on a fragile balance between stimulus and austerity?
Exactly. France must find a way to stimulate growth while reducing debt. But with a distrustful population and international investors watching closely, it's a very risky balancing act.
And if it doesn't work?
France risks losing even more credibility on the global economic stage. But the French are resilient, and sometimes it's in adversity that they find innovative solutions.
Now let's talk about industry and energy. Has France made progress, or is it still lagging in these areas?
It's a mix of both. Since 2017, Macron has pursued a reindustrialization strategy. 300 new factories have been established, which is encouraging after a decade marked by mass closures. But foreign trade remains a major problem, with a deficit exceeding 85 billion euros.
And for energy, where does France stand?
Macron initially promised to reduce reliance on nuclear energy, but the global energy crisis forced him to change course. The result? He announced the construction of 6 new nuclear reactors to secure energy supplies.
And what about renewable energy?
It's progressing, but slowly. France has invested in wind and solar energy, but administrative hurdles and local opposition have delayed projects. Meanwhile, Macron has pledged to phase out coal by 2027, a bold but necessary goal to meet climate commitments.
So, nuclear remains central despite everything?
Exactly. France still relies on nuclear for 70% of its electricity. It's a strength, but also a vulnerability if technical or political issues arise.
And what does the population think?
Opinions are divided. Many support nuclear for its low CO2 emissions, but others fear environmental risks and want a faster transition to renewables. And with rising energy costs, tensions are high.
And on a European level, is France playing a major role?
Yes, Macron is pushing for European energy sovereignty. He wants to reduce dependence on Russian gas and strengthen local supply chains. It's an ambitious vision, but one that requires strong cooperation among member states.
So, in your opinion, can France become a leader in sustainable energy?
It's possible, but it will require colossal investments and bold reforms. The balance between ecological ambition and economic reality will be key.
We've reached the final part, foreign affairs. What has Macron's strategy been in this area?
Macron has positioned himself as a strong advocate for Europe. He's called for a stronger European Union, especially with the post-COVID recovery fund. But his ambitions for a unified European defense have often been hindered by other member states.
And relations with the United States? Were they stable?
Not really. Under Trump, they were tense. Disagreements on climate, trade tensions, and the AUKUS submarine deal in 2021 was a shock. Australia canceled a massive contract with France in favor of the US and UK. Under Biden, there's been a thaw, but mistrust lingers.
What about Russia? Macron tried to mediate, didn't he?
Yes, before the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Macron tried to maintain dialogue with Putin. But once the war began, France aligned with European sanctions and even sent Scalp missiles to help Ukraine. A firm but risky stance.
And China? How is Macron handling that relationship?
It's tricky. He seeks economic deals, like with Airbus, but also criticizes China on human rights. Macron is trying to maintain strategic independence, which is a balancing act amid the US-China rivalry.
Okay, then Africa? A traditional terrain for French diplomacy?
That's complicated. Macron promised to modernize relations with Africa, but several countries like Mali and Niger have demanded French troops withdraw. A rise in anti-French sentiment has weakened France's influence on the continent.
Overall, what does this mean for France?
France is trying to play on all fronts, but with mixed results. Its international ambitions are often held back by internal dysfunctions and negative perceptions abroad. The real question isn't if France can retain a place, but if it can still inspire trust as a credible leader.
So, to sum it all up, where does France stand today in this whirlwind of change?
France is at a critical juncture. On the one hand, it maintains a central position thanks to its history, diplomacy, and role in Europe. On the other hand, it's held back by a political class often seen as out of touch with the people's realities. Leaders struggle to offer a clear and inspiring vision for the future.
And the consequences?
If this gap between leaders and citizens continues to widen, France risks losing not only its internal unity, but also its voice on the international stage. To reclaim prominence, it must first resolve its contradictions and rebuild trust between its institutions and its people.
A massive challenge, but perhaps a necessary one. Thank you for this uncompromising analysis. This is Open Mind Galaxy, signing off.